Welcome to the All-Star Athlete Podcast, your guide to mastering the mental game and reaching your full potential. Today's sponsor is Well Traveled. Whether you're grinding through long days, pushing your limits in training, or constantly on the move, your body takes a toll. Fatigue, hectic schedules, and changing environments can weaken your immune system. Give it a boost with Well Traveled, a drink mix with clean, clinically proven ingredients for immunity and no added sugar. It's a smarter alternative to Emergen-C. Just open a packet, mix with water, and enjoy. Right now, save 25% when you use the code ALLSTAR on the Well Traveled website. That's gowelltraveled.com/discount/AllStar. Again, save 25% when you use the code ALLSTAR on their website. Stay well on the go with Well Traveled. If you've been listening to the podcast and you've found the episodes to be informative and or interesting, I encourage you to subscribe to the podcast. I will be releasing episodes weekly, so subscribing to the podcast is the best way to stay up to speed on when the new episodes are released and to make sure that you don't miss any of the content. Also, liking each episode, if you have in fact been enjoying the content, as well as leaving any questions or comments that you may have down below, also go a long way in supporting the podcast. So thank you so much for listening and enjoy the show. Hello everyone and welcome back to the All-Star Athlete Podcast. Today we have a very special guest. I would like to introduce to the show and to our listeners, Dr. Aubrey Newland, who is an associate professor of kinesiology at California State University, Chico, whose focus is on sport and exercise psychology. Dr. Newland, it's truly a pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
If you could just take a moment to briefly introduce yourself to our listeners and share your background in kinesiology and sport and exercise psychology as well.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. So I started out with my education in this area with a degree in physical education. I was an athlete growing up and really just wanted to stay involved. And so from my limited perspective at that time, I thought the best route was I want to be a physical education teacher and I want to coach. And then I eventually realized that that wasn't the right way to go about this. And I learned a few things along the way and then got a master's degree at Western Illinois University. And that was a kinesiology, sports science degree, but the emphasis was sport and exercise psychology. And then I went on to do a PhD in also exercise science, and that was, again, emphasis in sport and exercise psychology. So I've had a pretty good educational background, and then also just in the last maybe 9 or so years have been working with athletes a little bit on and off. My primary job is to be a professor. So I teach. That's my main source of income and that's my main job. But I do get a lot out of working with athletes. It's just a lot of fun for me.
Okay, so it sounds like you've kind of always been involved in sports. You were an athlete when you were younger and you had maybe such an intrinsic value of exercise and moving your body and sports and an interest in sports that you always wanted to be, you saw yourself being involved in that field moving forward in your life. And so you chose to pursue degrees in kinesiology and then eventually sports psychology as a route to stay involved in that field. Is that correct?
Yeah. And I've always had a little bit of an interest in why people act the way they do and what's going on in the mind that's causing their behaviors. And so that was something that was really prominent and figured into why I do the things that I do and where I ended up today.
Okay, so you would say that your interest in why people do what they do, sort of that psychological aspect, is sort of what inspired you to pursue a career in the field of sports psychology and ultimately start teaching at Chico State, which is where you are right now. Is that true?
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
Okay. And your primary job is an educator, an associate professor of kinesiology. And you also said that you've worked with athletes, so you're a mental performance coach as well. And you said, I believe earlier, that you've been working with athletes for the better part of a decade, I believe, if I heard you correctly. So, speaking to that, what types of athletes have you worked with, and how has that sort of shaped your approach to mental performance and teaching, if there is any crossover there?
Yeah. So a lot of times, parents in the area in Chico will reach out to me, and it's a lot of just kind of word of mouth. And so I've worked a lot with high school athletes, and then a little bit with some college athletes. Not very many here from actual at Chico State. So most of them have been elsewhere that I've been able to make connections and then get referrals. So some D1, D2, some junior college athletes, and from lots of different sports. So we've got some from like basketball, softball, baseball, team sports, volleyball. And then I've worked with a couple distance runners and some one thrower, track and field person. So got a kind of a smattering of different sports, which is fun for me. And I actually even worked with a bowler, a guy who was like, I'm gonna get on the pro bowling circuit, and he was really close to it. So for me, that was really interesting to think about, like, wow, I actually don't know what mental skills need to be involved in bowling. Don't you just throw the ball down the alley and hope it hits some pins? I mean, I know there's some science to it, but yeah, so that was a lot of fun.
Well, I would imagine to that point that there's a lot of crossover with bowling as there is with other sports such as golf, for example, tennis, more of your individual sports. With bowling, right? You're typically matched up against another person, but oftentimes it's just what is the maximum score that I can achieve. For those that may be unfamiliar with how the scoring in bowling works, the maximum score that you can get in any individual game is 300. That's referred to as a perfect game. So, depending on if you get strikes or spares, you're trying to achieve a maximum score of 300 in a game. Just as a golfer is focused on their individual score in the sense of golf, it's the lowest score that you can achieve for an individual round determines the winner. So I would imagine there's probably some crossover there in terms of pre-shot routine, mental performance, stress, anxiety management, dealing with a fellow competitor that's right next to you. So did you find some crossover there?
Yeah, absolutely. And pretty much across all sports, regardless of if they're individual or if they're team sports, is just this common element of how do I deal with pressure? How do I manage pressure? And so all of the things you just mentioned in terms of self-talk and confidence and routines, all of those kind of overlap and play into how athletes are going to manage pressure.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier that you've worked with sort of a range of athletes of different ages, probably both men and women, boys
Yes.
and girls. Is that correct?
Yes.
What would you say is the age range of athletes that you've worked with, the youngest athlete and the oldest athlete?
So actually just recently I've been working with a 15-year-old girl, and that's probably the youngest that I've worked with. The oldest I would say is probably mid to late 20s. And really late 20s based on eligibility and COVID eligibility. Now some of the athletes are getting a little bit older, but it's been fascinating to think about the differences even in just a 10-year span between this 15-year-old and some of the older athletes that I've worked with. Mostly I think it's partially developmental in terms of their processing of their own thoughts, but it's also something about their individual characteristics that either allows them to be successful in processing their thoughts, or that inhibits them from, thinking through clearly. And there's a range for every individual.
Right. So you've worked with some younger athletes as young as 15 and some, I don't know if we'll call them older, but certainly with respect to the other age group, older, right? So mid to late 20s. Mm-hmm. And you would say that there are distinct differences in the mental performance struggles that each group has, or talk to me about that a little bit. Offer some clarification on that if you could. Yeah,
absolutely. So for instance, this younger girl that I was working with, she tends to not be able to process her own thoughts as well, I'm finding. And so my approach to working with her is a little bit more of recognizing, like, oh, she doesn't recognize that this thought process is causing a problem. And so I need to ask her more in-depth questions. I need to maybe ask her to reflect a little bit more. And I've also had athletes who are early 20s who cannot do that, or who really struggle with processing their own thoughts. So I do think that there's some developmental differences, absolutely, but there's also some individual differences. So it's hard for me to just say younger athletes have these characteristics. Maybe the biggest thing that I think is a difference in how I approach them is that I do change the vocabulary that I use with the younger group, try to make it more digestible for them.
Okay. So the younger group is a little bit less knowledgeable about sort of advanced vocabulary, and you try to break it down into a little bit more of a digestible, to use your word, format, so that they kind of understand it a little bit better on a more basic level.
Yeah.
Okay. And you talked about sort of processing their own thoughts, right, as something that certainly I believe all of us really, but athletes included, because that's what we're talking about here, develop a better skill as we age, right? We're better at having sort of that self-reflection and sort of metacognition, being aware of our own thoughts as we age. But with respect to specific mental barriers that athletes face, like what are some of the most common mental barriers that athletes face that you've worked with?
Yeah, there's a range. One of the things that I just love about working with athletes is it's a puzzle. Each person has their own set of, struggles, and the challenge is how do we make things fit so that they can get the best out of their performance. So, generally I would say dealing with pressure is going to be the biggest thing, maybe followed by confidence and focus, and also some coaching struggles, like how to interact with coaches. There's a huge power dynamic there between coaches and athletes. And so how do I, as an athlete, navigate that? So that's been something also.
Okay. And when you're working with athletes who are struggling mentally, because that's, typically why somebody would come to a mental performance coach, they're having a difficulty with their mental performance. Where do you usually start with somebody that comes to you? Is it always the same starting point, or is there some variability to that as well?
Yeah. Like I mentioned, athletes to me are like a puzzle, like every human, right? So I don't believe that there's a set way of approaching each athlete. Now, having said that, I do believe that my personal approach, it kind of evolves from the same starting point. So I will ask them to tell, when they first come in, tell me about yourself. And then, so I want to just gather tons of information. And then I do use a validated scale initially, and I just have them do that either in person. I'll give them a few minutes to go through it, or I have them do it ahead of time if they can. And that gives me general categories where they might have some weaknesses, but I don't rely on that 100%. I just use that as information for me. So it might give me things like, oh, their score was really low in coping with adversity, or maybe they are worried mostly about what others are thinking of them. So that gives me kind of a starting point. I also use a technique that's called performance profiling, where I get at the main skills mentally and physically that are going to be reflective of an elite athlete in their sport. And I have them come up with those, and then they'll kind of rank themselves on where they're at and then where they want to be. So we're identifying with them in the process some gaps that they're seeing in their own mental skills. So those are a couple things that I start out with initially, but I don't just want to jump in without knowing a little bit about them.
Okay, so I heard sort of three main tools that you use to determine where you want to start with a new athlete that's coming in and wants to work with you. The first one is just that you sit down and you kind of get to know them, right? Sort of building that rapport. Maybe you're talking about some, or potentially would be talking about some sensitive subjects. And so it helps to build that trust first when you sit down with somebody before you're asking them to talk about potentially vulnerable information. So you're just kind of sitting down and getting them comfortable and finding out some information about them. Then you're using the second thing I heard was now is this a peer reviewed, scientific literature validated research paper type scale? Talk to me about that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's called the Athletic Coping Skills Inventory. It's a 28 question, and it just asks athlete to reflect on how they feel most of the time, all of the time, frequently, seldom. And so it just gives a basic overview. I think that there's a lot of value in that for me, just to get a snapshot picture, but I don't rely on that solely because you can't just, it's not a diagnostic tool, essentially.
So that just gives you an idea of where they might be stronger or struggling in certain common areas.
Yeah, and then I'll kind of follow up and ask them some questions and kind of poke at those areas a little bit so that I can get a sense of like, do they really think that, or was this just something that they're filling out and they weren't really thinking through?
Okay. And then the third thing that you mentioned was another tool. Is this another scientific literature type tool? Remind me of what that third thing was again.
Yeah, it's called performance profiling. It's a technique that's been well documented in research, but visually what you would get is a wheel, kind of looks like a target, so it has different levels, and then you just identify skills, and then you have athletes identify where they're at.
Okay. Fascinating.
Yeah.
So, with respect to specific things that athletes struggle with, especially in today's modern society where focus and attention are often lacking, shall we say, everybody's got a little computer in their pocket, i.e., their phone, at least one. It's just, people have their Apple Watches. There's just so many distractions around in today's society, whether we're in the classroom, walking down the street, or on the pitch of an important sports match. So focus and attention seem to be a challenge for a lot of athletes as a general rule, and for a lot of people, but the scope of this podcast being athletes. So is this something that you work on with athletes? In other words, honing their focus and attention. And if so, how are you helping athletes stay mentally present during practice or competition or just everyday life? Is that something you work on?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, as I've evolved as a practitioner, as a mental skills coach, then I have actually come to believe that about 90% of all mental skills related issues in performance are related to focus. And so I know that's a huge number. I feel like, I don't know if you've seen the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Like, there's the father in there. He's super proud of his Greek heritage, and he always says, like, give me a word, give me any word, and I'll tell you how it relates to Greek. And I want to say the same thing. I want to say, give me a problem, a mental skills problem, anything, and I'll tell you how it relates to focus. And so I've gotten pretty proficient at identifying within every single issue, you know, what is it that relates to focus there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you would say almost all mental performance struggles relate back to focus.
Yeah.
Like that is almost, if you would say, like the root of all mental performance or most mental performance issues.
Yeah, there's a few, I would say, that maybe fall out of that, but very few. And so, I'll give you some examples. In just working with a couple athletes that I maybe tell a couple stories. Working with a D2 women's basketball player, she came to me and said, you know, I really, really have this strong desire. I'm super motivated to make the all-conference team my senior year. And she's like, but I'm really struggling. I'm not quite meeting the mark, right? I'm not like getting to the points per game that I know are going to get me there. And she said, I'm finding myself during the games looking up at the scoreboard that has individual points listed for each player. You know, some of the scoreboards list, you know, number 12 has this many points, you know, and it's updated live, right? And so she was really focusing on the wrong thing. And so we talked through, how can you overcome that? And one of the things that I used in talking to her about this focus problem was, we need to shift the focus away from the scoreboard, obviously, and onto more relevant things. But what worked really well for her to get her into her comfort zone while playing was that she wanted to focus on the feeling of the shot. Because she thought when you're just sitting in any place, you're not performing the skill, you could actually think about, what is the feeling in my muscles of that movement, right? You could imagine that. And so without like teaching her about imagery and visualization, I kind of said, just imagine what it feels like to shoot the perfect shot that you, like, when it leaves your hands, you know it's going in. And so every time you get the ball and you're getting ready to shoot, I want you to just channel that type of a feeling rather than having a thought about it. So we're shifting her focus to the body and what she's feeling rather than looking at the scoreboard and worrying about that.
Yeah, so two main things that I heard there was that first, it sounds like this athlete, this D2 basketball athlete, was focused more on destination or sort of an ego mindset, which is to say that she was focused more on an outcome than on the process itself. So she was more concerned about putting up a certain points per game average, or even in the game, she was focused more on how many points she had scored rather than probably whether or not they were even winning or anything else. She was fixating on that. So it sounds like you were able to help shift her mindset to more of like a growth or a mastery mindset oriented mindset, where she's focused now more on how I'm performing and then letting the results end up where they are, which ultimately, I think you and I both know that the results are going to be better if we focus on the process than if we focus on the destination.
Yes.
And the second thing is, it sounds like you were basically guiding her from taking a theoretical concept, which is to say imagery and visualization, and not really explaining that to her too much. I mean, maybe you kind of touched on briefly sort of what this is that we're working on, and then you helped her to implement that. In other words, just focus on what the feeling of the shot is. So in the game, but then also like as I'm sitting here in my bedroom, you know, recording this podcast, I have played basketball. You've played basketball. We can probably both, having not really much practice doing this, like I can get the feeling of what it feels like to shoot a basketball right now. And the scientific literature, I believe, shows that mentally practicing, our brain can't really tell the difference between physically and mentally practicing. So if you were able to get her to practice that mental exercise when she wasn't playing, that probably translated into her performing better on the court. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think for her, a lot of it was what you talked about with the shift in her perspective. And I just want to emphasize too that this was not an athlete who was selfish. She was a team player. She did not want the spotlight on her at all. So her focus was maybe a little bit out of character for her. She recognized that this is my last season as, playing college basketball. I want to be recognized, and just that tiny little shift in her, like what her normal focus was, kind of made a big difference for her.
Yeah. Now I'm interested to know, did she make the all-state team or the all-conference team or whatever it was?
Yeah, I think she did. She was a phenomenal player. So yeah, she ended up really excelling the last part of the season, and was really helpful in terms of me reflecting on my own skill set and like, oh, this is something that could be really valuable for athletes.
Yeah, sounds like that was a great technique that you used with that athlete and helped her achieve her goals. So, sort of a testament to what sports psychology and mental performance coaching can do in actuality for athletes. So
Yeah,
that's great.
yeah. Can I share one more story
Yeah, of course.
that came to mind? So, working with a high school baseball player, and he was actually pretty mature for his age, but he would, mention to me that sometimes he would get kind of distracted during games. Like he would hear his dad's voice, or he would, be thinking too much about, the mistake that he had made or that someone on his team had made. And so we wanted to think more about his distraction, for lack of a better term, because it wasn't really distraction, it was just his maybe reaction to feedback that he was getting. So we were working on a strategy on that, and this was in my office, and we were using an online game where it was a memory and attention training game, and you have to hit the right button at the right time, and it's an audio and a visual thing that's happening. And so as he was doing this, it lights up red if you get it wrong, and it lights up green if you get it right. And he said to me after we did one round of that, he said, I'm really distracted by the red. When I get it wrong, I'm really distracted. And so we said, well, let's put a piece of paper, tape it up on the screen over top of where the feedback is. And so it's not as distracting. And he did so much better. Because once he saw that he got one wrong, then he was thinking about, oh no, I'm going to get the next one wrong. And I got that wrong. Oh no. And he just kind of spiraled. And so we recognized that he needed a tool to help him to stop being distracted by feedback that people were giving him, either his coaches or his parents or his teammates, or him judging other people's mistakes as well.
Interesting. So to tie this back into basketball again, imagine a shooter, right, is normally maybe a very good shooter, and they're participating in a basketball game, and they shoot, they miss their first shot, and that gets in their head. I missed. Okay. Then they shoot again, they miss again. Then these are shots maybe that they would normally make. Now all of a sudden this shooter is 0 for 5, 0 for 6, and they're really in their head about, I haven't made a shot yet, and that's starting to impact their confidence. So then they're sort of further spiraling and maybe missing even more shots, kind of choking or getting the yips, I guess, by any number of other terms you could call it. I think we both know that the best shooters have the shortest memory, essentially. Your Kobe Bryants, your Michael Jordans, your LeBron Jameses, your Sue Birds, your Breonna Stewarts, your whoever you wanna say, right? These are athletes that they're so confident in their ability to make the next shot, they've already forgotten about the one before that, whether or not it went in. So it sounds like maybe you were working with this athlete on kind of blocking out that distraction or developing a shorter term memory almost. and helping them move on to whatever the next one is. Because as soon as he, I think, right?
Yeah.
As soon as he blocked out that red or green light and didn't know whether or not he even got the last one right or wrong, he wasn't concerned about that, and then could therefore focus on exactly what the task is at hand right now, whether it's the question on the screen or the next shot. And it sounds like that helped him perform much better. Is that true?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I try to, I don't know where I picked up this phrase. I read it somewhere. It's not my own phrase, but the idea of the power, the point of power is in the present moment, right? The only power that we have over our performance is the present moment. And I try to reiterate that to my athletes because that is a big issue, holding on to mistakes, and then it starts to spiral them into a lack of confidence, and even maybe, I need to adjust my shot, or I need to adjust my swing, and when really it's not. It was just like a one-off, well, you missed that, you mishit it or whatever. And so they get a little bit too much in their head and try to make adjustments when really just let it go, right? Be in the moment. It's actually fascinating to think about, but just because we make one mistake literally has no bearing on the percentage that you're going to make the next shot or you're going to hit the next ball or whatever. But mentally it has a huge impact, right? So we just got to learn how to let it go mostly.
Right. I would say in an optimal case scenario, missing the last shot shouldn't, physically anyways, have an impact on whether or not we make the next shot. In a vacuum, each shot should have the same percentage of going in. But if we let our past misses mentally impact our mental and therefore physical state, ultimately it does impact future shots. But optimally, we would like to compartmentalize those two occurrences and perform each shot as much in a vacuum as it possibly can be in real life.
Yeah, and maybe even on the flip side of that, I heard Kobe Bryant once say, like, man, I've missed 6 shots in the row. That means that the chances that my next shot is going to go in are really high. So he was kind of thinking about it in the opposite way, like the more that I miss, well, the higher the increase that the chances are that that's going to go in.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you look at it strictly from sort of a return to a statistical, the law of averages, if you average shooting 50% from the field over your career and you're 0 for 5 in a game, statistically, you should be thinking to yourself, I'm going to make the next 5 shots because I'm a 50% shooter. Right. And one thing I actually like to use when I work with my own clients, and a way that I like to mentally sort of visualize this concept for myself when I'm golfing, for example, let's say golf. I like to always look at the positive side of a situation, right? So let's say I've missed 5 putts in a row. This is the same example as the basketball example that we just had. I've missed 5 makeable putts in a row. In my head, I'm thinking I'm going to make the next putt or the next 5 putts because I am a 50% putter from this range. So mentally, I'm focused on the positive side of the upcoming putts. If, however, I have made 5 putts in a row, I do not think to myself that I'm going to miss the next 5 putts because this thought does not serve me in any way. As a matter of fact, because I've made 5 putts in a row, I am thoroughly believing to myself that I am going to continue making putts because I'm in the zone, or I just make putts from this range, or whatever. There is no thought whatsoever about that I'm going to miss a putt. So regardless of the previous 5 putts, I'm always thinking to myself, this next putt is going in.
Yeah.
That's a concept that I like to refer to as a self-fulfilling prophecy as well, where we can kind of get into positive and negative self-talk potentially maybe a little bit later, but that's the kind of thought where it's like positively you want to think as affirmatively as possible towards your next action, because to your point that you made a minute ago, the power that we have is now. If I'm thinking positively about what's about to happen, it's at least as likely, if not more likely, to positively impact me then have no effect at all. It's either going to be neutral or positively impact me. Whereas if I think something negative, it's probably at best going to be neutral, if not negatively impact me. So therefore, you should always be thinking something positive about the outcome, about what is about to happen.
Yeah, and I've been really fascinated with that idea because I think sometimes in trying to sell not sell literally, but like convince people that sports psychology is an important concept, they confuse that with like, oh, don't you just have to think positive and everything works out well? And I want to say like, actually, there's a little bit more to it, right? We simplify it sometimes too much into it's got to be positive or negative thinking, right? But in reality, some of those neutral thoughts, or I actually have tried to use more the language of helpful versus unhelpful thoughts. So rather than lying to myself and saying, I'm going to do great, I'm the best athlete out here, right? Then I can say something that's more helpful about like, this is going to be challenging, but I'm going to get through it, right? Which is a helpful, reality-based statement that I try to kind of adopt that language now for my athletes' sake, because sometimes it's confusing to them that like, well, I think really positively all the time. I'm a positive person. And I'm like, yeah, but there's a little more to it.
Yeah, so your sort of neutral or helpful versus unhelpful thoughts, as opposed to positive versus negative, you're just thinking realistically. Like, this is a challenging situation, but I'm prepared for this,
Yeah.
for example. So you're sort of adding that qualifier, the I'm ready for this. It's like when athletes, or really anybody, once again, is stressed or anxious, right? That physically, which this ties into the next question that I want to ask you about, manifests in such a way as I'm feeling a little bit hot, maybe I'm sweating a little bit, maybe I'm kind of jittering around a little bit, my heart is racing. People that struggle with that sort of with those sort of physical symptoms view that as anxiety or stress and kind of tend to spiral towards the negative side of the coin. Whereas I have learned, and I teach my clients that I coach, to view that as excitement, right? That this is physically my body preparing me for something that's about to happen. It's sympathetic nervous system activation. My heart rate is elevating. I'm getting some adrenaline into my bloodstream, and my blood sugar is maybe boosting up a little bit. My body is physically getting ready to perform. And so if you view it through that lens, you often help yourself as opposed to hurt yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%. I think from an educational standpoint, that's exactly what I would do. Is I would teach them that there's some interpretation element that they need to manage in terms of, instead of saying, oh no, I'm nervous, I'm anxious, this must mean that I'm not ready or I'm not prepared. Instead, they have to take on the responsibility to, I'm interpreting those symptoms, right? The normal arousal that happens in my body, I just have to interpret that in a way that's going to be helpful. So I take an educational perspective and approach to that, like you just described there, and the idea of actually teaching athletes that there's a reason why their body starts to react that way, not just physiologically, but it's usually preceded by a thought. And so your thoughts then lead to how you feel, but sometimes we don't capture that thought. We just think there's an event, like I'm getting ready for this race, and so I feel nervous. But we don't acknowledge that there's a thought in between those things, right? And that thought then leads to the ramping up of our nerves, the arousal that happens. So I try to teach athletes that like that point where you can actually make a difference, that point of impact, is recognizing the thought process. And you kind of alluded to that a little bit earlier in terms of like the metacognition, or thinking about our thoughts or our awareness.
Okay, so you would say that your approach to helping athletes understand and manage physical symptoms, so racing heart, shallow breathing, sweating, shaky hands, is to help them interpret what those feelings mean and also have sort of a self-awareness of any thoughts that may be happening in and around that time. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. Because in any situation, whether it's in sport or not, we always have a thought, even if it's not a conscious thought, that's driving how we feel. And so recognizing that that thought is sometimes skipped over, but we need to like harness that power. Like that's actually really powerful thing, is like, ooh, what thought just led me to start feel butterflies or start to have my heart race? Was it that I'm excited, like that I'm, really excited for this race? Or was it that, ooh, I just saw someone who last time did something dirty on the course and like, boxed me out or something? And so having awareness of that thought and then using some self-talk to manage that.
Okay. Do you feel like that's a pretty advanced concept, especially the point where you were talking about like some of these thoughts, quote unquote, that we may be having are subconscious. Mm-hmm. So how would you teach an athlete to be aware of or change subconscious thoughts? Is there like mindfulness, self-awareness? Like how do you dial into that?
Yeah, good question. I think the thing that I usually have athletes start with keeping a log of their thoughts, whether it's, depending on the athlete and what their particular struggle is. I might have them do it after each practice, and I just want them to write down some of the thoughts that they recognized. That's it. I just want them to start there by like, ooh, I had a thought during practice or whatever. Another thing, like you mentioned, is mindfulness, teaching them some strategies about just being aware of the thoughts and then letting go of those thoughts. So it starts for me, I guess, with awareness of the thoughts. That's, if you don't know that you're having those thoughts, then you can't manage them, right? And then the second piece would be managing them using mindfulness strategies.
Okay, so you would say perhaps the first step is some post-activity self-reflection, for example, like looking back at the game that I just participated in or the practice that I just participated in, thinking, in a safe, quiet, certainly relatively more calm space, taking some time to reflect on what just happened and how they felt, and maybe trying to bring some awareness to some thoughts after the fact when they're not quite so distracted by the task at hand, and then going from there.
Yeah, and once they get into this space where they're aware of their thoughts, then sometimes I'll recommend that they, tentatively try this during a practice, but they wear maybe like a rubber band or something on their wrist during a practice. And then when they recognize that they have a thought that's impacting their performance, then they take the rubber band and they switch it to the opposite wrist. Just as a physical acknowledgement of, okay, I just noticed a thought, right? So it's just another like more real-time practice of building awareness for the athletes.
Okay, so you're giving them kind of a physical tool in the moment to help develop some awareness of what's going on.
Yeah, and that's pretty much all that it is. It's not a strategy in terms of like during a game you would be wanting to do that, right? It's only for practice, situations, because I want them to be able to recognize when that's happening, and when you do something physically to acknowledge it, then it's cementing that in their mind.
Okay. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum now. So we were just briefly talking about lack of awareness of thoughts and bringing some consciousness to some thoughts that may be detrimental to performance. In your experience, let's talk about overthinking. How does overthinking manifest in athletes, and are there any tools that you use to help your athletes that you coach with overthinking?
Yeah. Overthinking is kind of tricky for some athletes to understand because they say, well, my coach wants me to think about the next play or something like that. So maybe the first thing is just to clarify for them, what is overthinking? And it's usually related to worrying excessively about what others are thinking, or kind of berating themselves so much about a mistake that they're just, processing that and spiraling over and over again. Overthinking also manifests as trying to make in-game or in-practice adjustments that aren't needed. So there is some necessary adjustments, obviously, within sport. You're constantly adjusting. But if you're missing a few shots or hits or putts or, name the sport, that's probably normal, right? Like, no one is going to go 100%, even the best athletes in the world. And so helping them to recognize where that line is for them. If they're starting to tweak things in their shot, then I'm wondering whoa, is that something that's warranted? And it could be manifesting just overthinking. So I guess in terms of the second thing, the tools that I would use to help athletes manage that, similar set of tools, self-talk, right? Catching themselves saying, that's not a helpful process right now. So let's stop that. So kind of some thought stopping techniques. Another one that I've used that's helpful is kind of parking your thoughts, or putting it up on the shelf, right? Like, I can think about that later. I can analyze that later, but right now it's not helping my performance.
Yeah, that's actually one of my favorite techniques that I use personally and that I coach with my athletes as well. To take it a step further, I visualize myself when I'm having some unhelpful or negative thoughts. Maybe it's when I'm trying to go to bed, or if it's an athlete during the course of a game where they need to focus on what's happening right now and not the previous play or some other clutter that's going on up there in the head, is I put things up on the shelf, and I actually have like a box up on that shelf, and I visualize that I'm putting this thought in the box and then I'm closing the box. So it's compartmentalized. It's up there. I'm going to think about this later. And then I've personally developed this technique to the point that it's pretty effective at preventing me from thinking about whatever that thing is. And I think it's important to note that a lot of these techniques and strategies that you and I are discussing today are not going to happen overnight. Yeah. Just like a physical skill is not something that can be developed overnight. For example, if you didn't know how to hit a golf ball, if somebody's never golfed before and I brought them out to a driving range and I said, okay, I want you to hit this golf ball, you might be able to hit the ball. Maybe you won't even be able to hit the ball, to be quite frank, let alone hit it straight or with the correct loft or with any sort of consistency. Yeah. But with practice, consistent practice of the correct technique, you will develop the physical skill to hit the golf ball correctly. And the same is true with mental performance techniques. They require awareness and practice consistently over the course of a period of time in order to be effective. And they are absolutely effective, but they just need to be given a chance to develop and bloom and be implemented.
Yeah, well said. I would agree 100%. I'm glad you made that point, that the skills are, it's not like a magic pill. And I find that's a huge myth, that, I'll have a coach reach out to me and be like, hey, we've got a big game coming up. can you come and give a pep talk? And I'm like, whoa, that's not what I do, right? I help athletes develop skills, and that takes time and practice.
Right. Let's talk about another topic here, and that is coaching trauma or negative coaching experiences. I've had some, you've probably had some. In fact, most athletes who have participated in any sport for a prolonged period of time have probably had a bad coach, quote unquote, or a negative coaching experience. This is not something that's often talked about. It does show up in the media if there's a coach that has a particularly, outlandish blow up and it's caught on camera or something like that. But these things happen a lot, negative coaching experiences. What are some of the ways that you help athletes to cope with these situations and ultimately maybe rebuild trust and regain a sense of control of themselves after these negative experiences?
Yeah. So I guess maybe I want to just acknowledge what you said, that like this happens a lot. It happens more frequently than I would prefer. I think old school coaching, for lack of a better word, is rampant, and it's also part of the sport culture. If you get into any other setting as an employee or an employer, that's not appropriate behavior. But
Yeah, like yelling or screaming at somebody or condescending or threatening.
yeah. And even, I guess the only other maybe adult place where that happens is the military, right? That's so military and sport. And I don't have any expertise in military, so I'm not going to go there. But the idea of this is a unique place in sport that for some reason people still think it's acceptable to treat other people poorly, and it's got to change. And so I think there's some really, really good research out there on this that is exploring best coaching practices, and that's kind of my interest area in terms of research. So I'm trying to hold myself back from going down the rabbit hole of research because I want to keep it really practically focused. But you asked about coaching trauma and how to help athletes overcome that. So the biggest thing for me is I will encourage them to communicate with their coach in a setting where, and at a time when they are not emotionally high, right? When it's kind of a, low stakes environment. It's not in the middle of a game. It's not immediately after a game, but I want them to try and approach their coach. Now, I've worked with high school athletes, and some of them are like, I don't feel comfortable talking to my coach about this. And so then I'm like, okay, that's great. Like you don't, we can maybe build up to that and kind of work on some role plays. But I do encourage them to communicate as much as possible. If their coach is unresponsive, which is often the case, then the next step I try to teach them is that they need to recognize that that's out of their control. And so worrying about that and kind of trying to use up all their mental energy about that is not going to be a good use of their mental time and mental energy. But then also walking a boundary of what is the line for them in terms of what they're willing to take, for lack of a better word, or what they're not willing to go beyond. And they have a choice at any point to leave that situation. I know that right now transfer portal is like a huge impact in college sports. And I'm not saying I love the transfer portal, but in some cases, the coach is not healthy for the athletes. And so absolutely that gives them a way out. High school is a little bit different, but always I try to reaffirm to athletes that they have a choice. They can choose whether or not to be there or not.
Yeah, that's very insightful. And I think to go back to something you said earlier in the episode is that the approach is often different with younger athletes versus older athletes for a couple of different reasons. The first one being that when athletes are participating in sports at a younger age, let's say middle school or high school, the athlete is often viewed as or is physically an adolescent, right? And I feel like there's a bit of a different dynamic. You can agree or disagree with coaches and athletes at a younger age, where in any sport, the coach is sort of the coach and for lack of a better term, like in charge of the manager or the, in charge of the athlete. But at a younger age, it's more of like the athlete is down here and the coach is like up here, almost like a parental figure or somebody. It's like I don't know what the right terminology is, but like somebody that's like under another person.
Yeah,
right?
there's definitely a power dynamic there.
Right, power dynamic for sure. As you get older, and I would say this probably starts in college, right? The coach is still the coach of the team, but at this point, the athletes are now, I would say, physically adults, right? 18 plus, I think you're probably in most cases recognized as an adult. So now it's rather than like an adult to sort of child or adult to adolescent relationship, it's more of like an adult to adult relationship. Mm-hmm. And I feel like the relationship dynamics can be a little bit different. Whereas you were saying like it might be kind of difficult, or a child may lack the relationship skills to appropriately approach a coach and have a productive discussion, or have the coach take the athlete seriously without sort of disregarding them. And this could happen at an older age as well, in college certainly. But I think it's easier or more likely that a level playing field, for lack of a better term, will exist between the coach and the athlete. And I think it might be easier on a number of different levels, kind of as I just outlined, for that discussion to take place if the athlete is unhappy with the coach's behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even as I'm trying to kind of I want to tread lightly because I think it's different for every situation, but I think that there's always power dynamics, and that power from the coach, whether you're a college athlete or whether you are a youth athlete, is based on you control my playing time. And for high school athletes, I think that's compounded because of what you said. There is that you're an adolescent, you're a teenager versus an adult. But even when you get to the point where you're an adult, coach and athlete as both adults, I think it does still remain that the coach holds a lot of power there, and the way that they use their power is really insightful about how that's going to impact athletes.
Yeah. It's definitely a conversation worth having, and maybe we won't discuss it too much further today, but certainly something that needs to be looked into. And as you mentioned, and I will take a moment to mention our research paper that we actually published together, and I'll leave a link down in the show note captions for today's episode. But Dr. Newland and I have actually published a paper on this exact subject. The paper is titled Enhancing Athlete Outcomes Through Quality Coaching. And there's research out there and physical evidence that shows that athletes perform better when they have a more positive coach-athlete relationship.
Yeah.
There are tangible results, the tangible results, I'm not going to necessarily guarantee like a better winning percentage or any of this kind of stuff, but athletes respond better, the research shows, to positive coaching behaviors. And everybody is different. Some people like to be coached really hard but I would say that's more of the exception and not the rule. Most people as humans, as individuals, do not appreciate being disrespected and talked down to, and that shows in athletic participation and performance.
Yeah. And I'll just add, this is kind of my baby, like I mentioned. I love talking about coaching and great coaching practices. And actually, a grad student that I recently had just got a paper published that's about this, where she was very vulnerable and she played college basketball at multiple levels, D1, D2, junior college, and she talked about her experiences in that paper and related it to how it influenced her motivation and her self-confidence. So, I'd love to have another conversation with you at some point if you want.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if you have at this time. On previous episodes, I've given people the floor to talk about if they have any social media or websites or anything. Do you have any websites or social media or any way that people can get a hold of you if they have questions about anything that we've talked about today, or if you have any services, if you want to talk about your profession, your teaching platform at this time? Is there anything that you would like to share that you would, be comfortable sharing, that people could get a hold of you or reach out to you?
Sure. Yeah. My email is on the Chico State website, and I'm always happy to answer questions if people have that. I'm also on Instagram at Aubrey-Newland. You can send me a message. I'd be happy to respond to that. I think I'm really just passionate about helping athletes perform at their best, and recognizing that usually encompasses a huge mental component that gets overlooked quite a bit.
All right, definitely. Well, I'll be sure to include your information in the show note captions. And if anybody wants to reach out to Dr. Aubrey Newland and ask her any questions, she is more than willing to respond and help anybody out.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so let's move forward now. I want to continue actually talking about this aspect of teaching because, as you mentioned earlier in the podcast, your main profession, the thing that you spend the most time doing, is that you are a professor of kinesiology. So you've done the mental performance coaching, you've been teaching for a number of years as a professor. How do you bring those two disciplines together? So in other words, how are you bringing your experience with athletes into the classroom when teaching future sports psychology professionals in the field?
So I think that my teaching is enhanced so much by my practical experience working with athletes. One way that I bring it in is by teaching the concept. So I'll give them like a theoretical or research-based construct, and it might be kind of abstract at first, but then as soon as I can tell a story about I worked with this athlete and here was the scenario and this is what I did that related to that, then people just are gravitating towards stories more and more. And that's my experience with teaching, is that as soon as I start to tell a story, they're locked in, right? As opposed to when I'm talking about a theory or a research study, they kind of glaze over, eyes glazed over. So storytelling is a huge way that I integrate that. But I do think that it kind of works both ways. When I'm working with athletes, then it gets me curious about things that I'm doing with my teaching. There's quite a bit of overlap in terms of working with an athlete and teaching a class, right? The difference being there's a lot of people there. But the ways that you engage them, the ways that you change the language, so it gets me curious about that. And so a lot of times they're just working hand in hand quite a bit.
So you would say your experience in both disciplines, the mental performance coaching and the academic teaching, enhance each other. Mm-hmm. So your experience with the athletes allows you to bring more stories into the classroom, which helps get the students more engaged. So we're bringing the practical into the theoretical, and then the experience in the classroom as you learn more about sports psychology, because there's always new research and more things to learn about it. The more you learn on the academic side, then informs your coaching and probably enhances your practical coaching.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's spot on, because when I do work with athletes, then it's usually really supported by curiosities that I've had in either my research or my teaching, like questions that have come from people. So I would say also on the flip side of that, maybe something that a little bit of a different spin on that is that when I'm working with athletes, then I'm becoming more curious, and then I want to go do a research study to learn about, like, ooh, does this actually work? Like from a research standpoint in a scientific method way. And so it's one of the, benefits of my job, and one of the reasons I love my job so much is that constant curiosity and then learning new concepts. And the evolution of my understanding as a mental skills coach has been driven largely by my research and by new research that is coming out that I'm reading about.
Interesting. So it's definitely a two-way street. You run into some actual things going on with athletes. You maybe try and implement some strategies and some techniques for them, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. And then you bring those thoughts or ideas, or maybe you have some thoughts or ideas that you didn't implement, back to the research side of things, and maybe actually conduct a research study to see if maybe it worked with the athlete, maybe it didn't, but that could have been an isolated incident. And then you see, does this work generally speaking?
Yeah.
And the nice thing about conducting peer-reviewed research is you get other professionals to look at it and poke holes in it and see if they think the same way that you do, or if not, and then kind of rinse repeat. So it's this, cycle of science, so to speak. Hypothesize, did we get the results, that we thought we would? No. Okay, go back and try it again, and so forth.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
Okay. Have you, right, because you've been teaching for a while now, several years at least. How long have you been a professor, by the way?
This is finishing up my 10th year.
Okay. So a decade of teaching and many years of education prior to that. So you've been in the field for at least, 15, 20 years now, you would say?
Yeah. Yep.
And things are changing, I think, perhaps even rapidly within the field because of research, and then also actually what's physically happening on the field with athletes. What have you noticed, or have you noticed any changes in the mental challenges that athletes face today compared to earlier in your career?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, because yes, I do see a lot of new challenges popping up, and I think a lot of it is due to focus and issues with attention, attentional deficit disorder. That's a huge thing. And I'll be honest with you, sometimes I'm sitting across from an athlete talking to them one-on-one, and I'm wondering if they're paying attention. They're, in terms of like engagement, when I'm talking, sometimes they have to have something in their hands now. Like, and I have some little fidget toys that I'll like set out and be like, if you want to play with this, great. And so they have something, which that wasn't the case years ago, and maybe I'm just old school, but I think that that's because they always have a screen in front of them, right? And The other piece of that is the social media piece, and everything is captured on camera or pictures, and so there's a lot more worry about what others are going to think about me.
So you're concerned more about what others are going to think of you now than you used to be.
Yeah, well, I mean, sorry, that's what athletes are worried about, is like
Oh, okay.
this is now, made available to everybody, and I want to make sure that like my scores are good, whether it's my golf score, my bowling score, my batting average, that needs to be managed somehow, and just that constant pressure of like it's out there now.
So athletes now are a lot more concerned about what other people think of them, primarily because of things like social media and the availability of information that's readily there all the time.
Yeah, yeah, and misinformation, I would say also. Simplifying concepts that maybe aren't that simple, right? Or thinking there's only one way to do it. So, being on TikTok and seeing someone, this is how I work out. You probably experience this all the time, in the professional world that you're in with personal training. But same thing with social media about like mental skills training. I think they get simplified too much, and so athletes are like, "Ooh, I'm gonna try this," and then it doesn't work exactly how maybe it should for them, and they get discouraged and then just throw it out.
Yeah. I think kind of going back to one thing that you said earlier about the idea that there is no magic pill. So, first of all, I think I'm going to take that statement, or I'm going to define that two separate ways. The first is that there is no magic pill to resolve any one mental issue that, struggle that somebody may be having with respect to athletics. There's not just one thing that they can learn about, apply it, and overnight they're going to be better at not having, negative self-talk in
Yeah.
clutch moments. There's no magic. It's not going to happen overnight. The other way that you can sort of define that there is no magic pill statement is that there's no one size fits all approach to fixing anything. And to the point that you just made, I do see this a lot in the fitness world because I'm a personal trainer as well. There's no one workout routine that's going to work ubiquitously for every single person, no matter their age or their gender or their genetic makeup. There's no one size fits all. So in the mental performance world, just because one strategy worked for athlete A does not mean that that same strategy is going to work for athlete B. It might not work at all. It might work somewhat, but they might need a different approach. So I would say that is kind of where my head is at when we kind of talk about that.
Yeah, that tracks with the same things that I'm experiencing. And I think I'll just add on to that a little bit that when I work with athletes, their attention span seems to be shorter. And so that's maybe then perpetuating this idea of like, if it doesn't work the first time, they lose patience with it. And so maybe that bleeds into a lack of grit and resilience, and then it's just more about, and I'm mostly talking about younger athletes, right? I think most athletes who are maybe elite level athletes, college athletes, they've gone through some stuff to get them where they're at, so they understand what it takes. But younger athletes might struggle a lot, and maybe there's a little bit of entitlement there, depending on where they're from.
So they're quick to scrap a suggestion or an idea if it doesn't work immediately because of this idea of instant gratification and this idea that this should fix my problem because I saw it on social media and it fixed this other person's problem. So why didn't it fix mine? And if it didn't, like, I'm not using this.
Exactly.
Yeah. Whereas somebody that's a little bit older, an athlete that's been through a little bit more, I mean, a lot of it has to do, I think, with brain development, but they're going to stick with it, have a little bit more resolve, give it a second or a third or even fourth chance with the understanding that it might take longer for this fix to work.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. So that sort of ties into the next question that I wanted to ask you. You've got almost a decade worth of experience coaching as well as a professor. What, in your estimation, separates a good mental performance coach from a great mental performance coach?
I think there's definitely an element of fit between the athlete and the mental skills coach. So sometimes it doesn't have a lot to do with the actual skill set of the mental skills coach or mental performance coach, because maybe their personalities just don't fit, right? Or their approach doesn't work. So, but beyond that, I would say here are the things that I think are really important. The first one is someone that is going to be successful in the field of mental performance coaching needs to know some theory. They need to know the research. And based on the depth of their knowledge and theoretical background, then they're going to be able to then be creative and think outside the box about how these theories and how the research works. And I would say those two things go hand in hand. So there's not a step-by-step, here's the system that you use in order to get an athlete to be mentally firing on all cylinders, because there's some element of it's an art and a skill, right? So you have to know the knowledge behind it, but then you develop it into an art, right? And then, I mean, the last thing is pretty straightforward. It's just the ability to build connections with people, that rapport building, build a relationship with somebody.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask is, where does empathy play a role in differentiating between a good and a great coach? It's pretty high up there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Being able to, in other words, being able to put yourself in the athlete's shoes, because you could know theoretically what to do and have a great creative mind and have different options, but if you can't put yourself in the athlete's shoes, I think it could be difficult to, really understand what they're going through and coach appropriately.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. Empathy definitely plays a role. You have to be able to try and understand, and we use that term a lot, or that phrase a lot, of I'm going to put myself in someone else's shoes. But I think if you think about that a little bit more critically, then it does have its limits, right? Because let's say I'm working with an athlete who's played a sport, even if it's the same sport that I'm in or that I'm very familiar with, I am not that person. And so my interpretation of being in their shoes might be really different from their interpretation. So I think as a mental performance coach, understanding that the best way for me to fully understand their experience is to ask them good questions and to really care about those answers, listen really carefully. Those are really powerful. So I agree 100% empathy, but I think there's a limit to that, and acknowledging my own personal biases and saying, like, I don't know if I really fully understand. Let me follow up with this question. I think that's really important.
Okay. What advice would you give to young athletes, or really athletes of any age, who are dealing with burnout or identity struggles?
I would say, so there's this new academic concept that's being, I don't know if it's new, but I've just newly come upon it, that's called mental rest. So just like we need physical rest to recover from anything we do physically, we need some mental space. And what that entails is do something different that you don't do every day. So find something that you really enjoy that's not a part of the sport. And so I will ask my athletes sometimes, like, what do you do when you're not playing basketball? Or what do you do when you're not training? and they kind of look at me like, what else is there? And I want to say, well, don't you have other hobbies? And they're like, well, yeah, I like to listen to music or hang out with my friends. And I'm like, that's not a hobby, right? So they've got to find something else to do that's out of their normal routine and explore other identities beyond just being an athlete.
Yeah, I think that's really important because so many athletes, in order to succeed at really any level, but the higher the level, the more commitment and the more investment as far as time an athlete often has to commit in order to succeed at their sport. The higher you get, the more time investment.
Yeah.
You know, you're doing 2 workouts a day and you're structuring your whole day around when practice is or when the game is, and you're scheduling your classes around when practice is, and you're scheduling your meals around, and you're, scheduling whether or not you can even hang out with your friends because and sort of it consumes you to a certain point. And that's where people often struggle with burnout, is because that's all they're doing. And this is also why athletes suffer so much from losing their identity or struggling with identity loss, certainly when they get injured or after retirement, because if your whole life revolves around a sport and then all of a sudden you're not an athlete anymore, that can be a very big struggle for a lot of people. So I like the suggestion that you had about mental rest, one, because that will develop some compartmentalization and some separation from the sport while you are actively participating in it, therefore reducing the burnout because you're not constantly doing the same thing. And then two, that also will help in the transition out of athletics, because at some point everybody has to retire. As the saying goes, father time is undefeated. Mm-hmm. Although LeBron James is putting up a hell of a fight right now.
He sure is.
But developing these other aspects of our identity is very helpful, both while we're participating and then afterwards, because you have something else to fall back on once you're not an athlete anymore.
Yeah. And it just reminded me of there was a women's basketball player at Duke named Alana Beard years ago, and she played in the WNBA as well, but she made a comment in an interview once about, I love that I have friends who don't know anything about my sport, because I know that they like me for who I am and not because of my sport, and that I can talk about other things, right? So it just gives her a mental break. But if you talk to most athletes, all of their friends are connected to their sport in some way, or they made a friend because they were interested in that sport. So I would say find friends that are not involved in your sport, and that's valuable in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. A lot of athletes, and it makes sense, because if you spend all of your time in the weight room and practicing and, around your teammates, those are the people that you spend the most time with. So you're probably going to have similar interests and similar lifestyles. So you're going to be friends with these people. And athletes in high school and college tend to go to parties that are hosted by other athletes. And so if it's not athletes in their sport, it's probably an athlete in another sport, which you're still probably talking about athletics. Yep. So if you can find some friends that are into art or dance or hiking or whatever else, puzzles, I don't know, different hobbies that people have that are not athletics, you're going to have a built-in mental break, because you're probably not going to be talking about athletics with those people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or certainly a lot less anyways.
Yeah.
Let's talk about coaches. So not mental performance coaches. I'm talking about athletic coaches. What's one thing that you wish more coaches knew and understood about athlete mental health?
I think mostly I wish that they knew the impact that they have. I think they maybe overestimate the thickness of athletes' skin in terms of like, they know I care about them, so I can just, yell and scream at them, and that's totally fine. But I think that if they really had an understanding of, athletes generally look up to their coaches, and so that adds an additional layer of power that they have, that coaches have. And so I think the impact that they can have on an athlete, if they just recognize that if I just care about this athlete as a person, that's going to change a lot of things, and including how I treat them, which then is connected to their mental health.
So you would say that the one thing that you wish coaches knew about athletes' mental health is, I don't want to say how fragile it is, but how much the way that the coach interacts with the athlete impacts the athlete's mental health. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes coaches might think, well, they're a college athlete, or even if they're a high school athlete, they made the team, so don't they know that they're good? So that means I can tear them down. But I would say no, like, athletes are people. So you got to treat them as people first. So, and knowing how much impact they have.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely understand the whole like coach athlete power dynamic, just like I do manager employee power dynamic. But to the point that you made earlier in the show, in very few other cases is it okay for somebody to scream at, berate, talk down to a subordinate, I guess, for lack of a better term. Like if your boss, the department chair or somebody was to speak to you or act in a way towards you, like you see some of these coaches like on national TV, they will like scream at their, this isn't even, and it's probably happening a lot more off camera that we don't see. We see it on TV, these coaches like treating their athletes negatively. Like if that were to happen, it's totally unacceptable in other veins of society. And yet it still is rampant, I guess I would say, in athletics. And I don't think these coaches really have an understanding as to the impact of how they treat these other people.
Yeah. I'll just say one more thing, kind of adding onto that, because when coaches kind of lose it on their athletes, they're demonstrating a lack of emotional regulation, emotional control, and yet they are demanding that of their athletes when they're on the floor. And so it makes it feel very hypocritical, in my view, that like if I'm a coach, I can just completely lose control of my emotions and yell at you until you're, ripped to shreds. And that's okay for me, but not for you. Like you need to stay on the court and you can't lose your mind. So
it's very, very much a double standard.
Yeah.
I would agree with you for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more as we kind of come towards the close of our episode here. I want to talk about your work as a sport and exercise psychology professor and coach and researcher. Is there one moment, or maybe several moments, that have stood out for you over the course of your career as especially meaningful or impactful?
Yeah. A couple years ago, I had the chance to go on sabbatical, and a sabbatical is just a break from teaching, so you can go do some research. And so I chose to spend my time working with a particular collegiate women's basketball team, and my main interest was a research focused, but in turn I said I'll actually work with your team in any capacity as a sports psychology mental performance coach. And so that particular season, I don't know if this is a particular moment, right, but that season was super impactful for me because as a mental performance coach, even if you are working as an NCAA, embedded in a department, an athletic department, you're usually covering like 5 to 12 teams, like you're in charge of all these different teams. But I was able to spend time day in, day out with one team I was at all their practices. I went to all their home games. I was in the locker room, and having interviews with the coaches and the players, and then any players that wanted to come meet with me one-on-one for some mental performance coaching. I did that, and just kind of the impact that had on me was, if we had people embedded within each sports team in a perfect world, that would be ideal. So I know that's kind of thinking of like a utopian concept, but within that in particular, I learned a lot from that coach about how to interact with players. And she was an impressive coach. She is an impressive coach. And she adopted the idea that these are human beings. And that's super important to remember, that, no matter what I do as a coach, I keep that in mind. And she did live by that. She did not yell at them. She was very respectful. And in turn, they were very respectful, worked very hard for her. So that was kind of a long, convoluted, maybe answer to that. But that experience with that team was really impactful for me.
Yeah, and I mean, I fully followed the whole story there. It was kind of a whole semester of working with the team and the players individually and the coach, and being engulfed in the whole experience and the whole culture. But why was that so impactful for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it was impactful for me to see, because that's not my normal job on a day-to-day basis, right? I talk about it a lot. I talk about what it's like to be a mental performance coach. I think it was impactful, I guess, from two different perspectives. One is that it showed me the life of a mental performance coach, if you're fortunate enough to have that type of a situation. So it was informative to me about what would this be like if I wasn't a professor, if that's all I did was mental performance coaching. And on the flip side of that, it was meaningful in terms of relationships, building relationships with the team, with the athletes. There's a few of the girls there that I got really close to, and that was mostly born of their vulnerability in like coming to talk to me and telling me like, I'm struggling with this. Can you help me? And we kind of worked through it together as partners. And also the relationships with the coaches, all the coaches. And they were super educational for me, but then I also provided them with some help. And so it was kind of the relationships, connections. That's why I think it had the most impact on me.
So you would say that you're a very big relationship-oriented person.
Yeah.
And this opportunity was very impactful for you because you were able to develop some meaningful relationships with the men and women of this team, if there were any men as far as coaches, but obviously it was a women's basketball team, I think you said, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And also because you saw what it was like to be essentially a full-time mental performance coach, which was a really cool opportunity for you because while you do that sort of on the side, it's not your main profession. So it was a very insightful experience for you to be fully involved in that position.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that story. I really appreciate that. At this time, I'd like to ask if there's anything else that you would like to share that maybe we didn't cover today relating to your career as a sport and exercise psychology, kinesiology professor, or your mental performance coaching career?
Not really. It's been a lot of fun chatting with you. I would just say that, like, in a perfect world, if I had my own way, I would do the teaching, the research, and the consulting parts of this. But, you can't have more hours in the day than I do. So, but mental performance coaching actually is something that I do because it fills my soul. Like, it satisfies my soul, and it's not necessarily something that I do just because it's a profession. And so I think I fortunate enough to come at it from that perspective. So love what I do. Think I'm living my dream right now.
Yeah. I don't know, your plate is very full with your academic activities right now. Do you see yourself doing more mental performance coaching in the future? Would you like to move more in that direction? Are you looking for clients? Are you hoping that in the future you could have a mental performance coaching role? Or what does the future look like for Dr. Newland?
Yeah, good question. I think, yeah, ideally, like I would love to have, a few more clients, but I'm not actively recruiting or trying to get more clients just because, like you said, my plate is pretty full in my full-time job, but I do like to do it. And, I'm trying to build places within our community where my grad students can be more involved. And so I do like to see them succeed and have those opportunities as well. So that's kind of what the future is looking like, is like, how can I facilitate creating something in our community that would be helpful for grad students and kind of a symbiotic way with the community.
So sort of boots on the ground, active participation for the grad students at California State University, Chico, to actively practice mental performance coaching skills with the athletes or the athletic department in what you would call a symbiotic relationship, where the students are getting practice working with athletes and the athletes are getting help from working with students of mental performance coaching.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. That would be fantastic.
Yeah.
And if there's anybody that is the right person for the job, I think it's you.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, that will pretty much wrap us up for today. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to chat with me today and share your experiences about kinesiology, academics, and mental performance coaching at large. At this time, I'll ask if you have any closing thoughts.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
All right. Well, I look forward to chatting again sometime in the near future, and anything that you do in your career. I know you're doing a lot of great work in the academic and practical field of mental performance coaching. So thank you for everything that you do, and thank you for your time in chatting with me today, and we'll chat again soon.
Thank you.
All right, Dr. Newland. Bye-bye.